Today, we're going to dive into a really foundational concept in behavior analysis, simple schedules of reinforcement. These are basically the hidden rules that determine when our actions get rewarded, and because of that, how our behavior gets shaped over time.
So, to get us started, here's a question for you. What could a slot machine possibly have in common with your paycheck? I mean, they seem like they're from totally different worlds, right? But believe it or not, they operate on the exact same core principles. There are hidden rules at play here, and once you understand them, you'll start to see everyday behavior in a whole new light.
So let's get into it. Let's explore the basic architecture of our behavior. And these schedules, they're not just some abstract theory. They are the precise mechanisms that explain why we work hard, why we sometimes procrastinate, and why some habits are just so tough to break. So what exactly is a schedule of reinforcement? Well, at its core, it's just a rule. It's a rule that specifies which instances of a behavior will be followed by a reinforcer, or a reward. You can think of it as the when and the how of earning a reward for something you do. And this simple concept is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding and influencing behavior.
Now, to understand all of these schedules, we really only need to ask two basic questions. First, is the reward based on the number of responses, so how many times you do something? Or is it based on the passage of time, meaning the first thing you do after a certain amount of time has passed? And the second question is that requirement fixed and predictable, or is it variable and completely unpredictable? And the answers to these two questions give us our four basic schedules.
All right, let's start with the first category, ratio schedules. For these, reinforcement is all about counting. It depends entirely on the number of times the behavior is performed, and it doesn't matter how much time goes by.
The first type is called a fixed ratio schedule, or FR for short. The rule here is super simple and predictable. Reinforcement is delivered only after a specific, unchanging number of responses has been completed. So, for example, an FR5 schedule means you get reinforced after exactly 5 responses every single time.
So a fixed ratio schedule produces a very high rate of responding. It creates this really distinct pattern that we often call a break and run pattern. The person responds really quickly to meet the goal, gets the reward, and then they take a brief break. This is known as a post-reinforcement pause. And it makes sense. The larger the response requirement, the longer the pause tends to be. A perfect real-world example of this is a loyalty punch card at a coffee shop. You have to buy a specific number of coffees, say 9, to get that 10th one free. This leads to quick purchasing to complete the card, followed by a little pause after you've earned that free coffee. It's a perfect illustration of a fixed ratio schedule.
Okay, our second ratio schedule is the variable ratio schedule, or VR. Now here, reinforcement is still based on the number of responses, but the key difference is that the required number is unpredictable. It changes every time, but it varies around a set average. So a VR10 schedule means reinforcement comes after an average of 10 responses. It could be after 2, then maybe 18, then 10. You never know.
And the effect of this unpredictability is huge. Variable ratio schedules produce a very high and steady rate of responding with almost no pausing at all, because you never know which response is going to be the one that pays off, you just keep going. This makes the behavior incredibly persistent and highly resistant to extinction. That means the behavior will continue for a long, long time, even if the reinforcement stops completely.
And of course, the classic example of a variable ratio schedule is a slot machine. The player has no idea which pull of the lever will lead to a win, so the behavior of pulling that lever just continues at a steady, high rate. This powerful schedule is a huge factor in the compelling nature of gambling.
Now let's shift gears. We've talked about counting responses, so let's move on to watching the clock. Our second category is interval schedules. For these schedules, reinforcement is all about the passage of time. A certain amount of time has to go by before a response can even have a chance of earning a reward. First up is the fixed interval, or FI schedule. The rule here is that a specific, predictable amount of time has to pass, and then the very first response that occurs after that time is up gets reinforced. Any responses that happen during the interval don't count for anything.
This fixed time requirement creates a really unique behavioral pattern that we call the scallop effect. Right after getting a reward, responding drops to almost nothing. But as the end of that time interval gets closer, the rate of responding gradually speeds up, which creates this scalloped curve on a graph. You can think of it as the science of cramming for an exam. A biweekly paycheck is a great example of this schedule. For some people, work effort might be a little lower right after payday.
But then it often picks up again as that next payday gets closer. This cycle of pausing and then accelerating is the hallmark of a fixed interval schedule.
And that brings us to our final simple schedule, the variable interval or VI schedule. Just like with variable ratio, we're bringing unpredictability back into the mix. Here, reinforcement is available for the first response after a variable amount of time has passed. The time interval changes each time, but it centers around a specific average.
Because the time requirement is always changing, and you never know when a reward might become available, this schedule produces a really constant, stable rate of responding. There are very few pauses because, hey, a response at any moment could be the one that gets reinforced.
The analogy of fishing just captures this perfectly. You cast your line and you wait. A fish could bite in 1 minute or it could be 20 minutes. You just don't know. So what do? You have to keep your line in the water and stay ready. That steady, patient checking behavior is classic variable interval.
Okay, now that we've walked through all 4 simple schedules, let's put them side by side to really highlight the key differences between them.
This chart really summarizes everything nicely. So notice that ratio schedules, which are based on responses, produce much higher rates of behavior than interval schedules, which are based on time. And then if you look at predictability, the fixed schedules, that's FR and FI, both result in that pause right after reinforcement. But in contrast, the variable schedules, VR and VI, produce that steady responding with no pauses, all because of that unpredictability. It really shows how those 2 simple factors, responses versus time and fixed versus variable, create these distinct patterns of behavior.
So, why is understanding these schedules important outside of a lab or a textbook? Well, because once you learn to recognize them, you start seeing the underlying structure of behavior absolutely everywhere you look.
Understanding these principles is so important for effectively teaching new skills, for designing productive work environments, and even for preventing burnout, which can happen when a ratio requirement gets too high. It really does provide a scientific explanation for so many of our everyday habits. Ultimately, these schedules are operating in the background of our modern lives all the time. That variable ratio schedule is what drives the repeated swiping on a dating app. And that variable interval schedule, that explains the constant checking of your phone for new messages. Both are running on these fundamental rules. So the next time you find yourself repeating an action, just consider which schedule of reinforcement might be keeping that behavior going.